The wind howled through the towering pines, a mournful cry that sent shivers down Ethan Carter's spine. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his breath forming icy clouds in the frigid mountain air. The sun had set hours ago, swallowed by thick clouds that now obscured the moon. Darkness pressed in from all sides, an endless void stretching beyond the reach of his flashlight. Lost. The realization clawed at his chest like a primal fear, something buried deep in human instinct. He had strayed too far from the marked trail, distracted by the beauty of the untamed wilderness. One wrong turn had become two, and now the forest had swallowed him whole. His phone had lost signal hours ago. His supplies, just a small water bottle and a granola bar, were laughably inadequate. A low, distant howl pierced the silence. Ethan froze. Wolves. He had read about them in travel guides before coming to this remote part of the country, nestled deep in the Rocky Mountains. Wolves were elusive, avoiding humans whenever possible. But something about the eerie call unsettled him. It wasn't distant enough. Another howl followed, closer this time. Then a rustling sound, too heavy for the wind. Ethan swung his flashlight in a frantic arc, illuminating the dense undergrowth. His pulse thundered in his ears as he strained to see beyond the tangled brush. Then, just at the edge of the beam, two golden eyes glowed back at him. A wolf stood in the shadows, watching him. Heart hammering, Ethan took a slow step back, knowing sudden movements might provoke an attack. But the wolf didn't lunge. It didn't growl. It simply watched him, its intelligent eyes locked onto his. Then, as if making a decision, the wolf turned and padded away through the trees. A moment later, it stopped, glancing back over its shoulder. Ethan swallowed hard. Was it waiting for him? He hesitated, his rational mind warring with his instincts. Following a wild animal was the last thing any survival guide would suggest. Yet something deep inside whispered that this wolf wasn't a threat. It was a guide. Taking a shaky breath, Ethan stepped forward, following the golden-eyed wolf into the dark unknown. The forest was eerily silent as Ethan followed the wolf's steady pace. The crunch of his boots in the thin layer of frost-covered leaves was the only sound accompanying them. The farther they went, the more Ethan realized how lost he had truly been. He had wandered miles from any recognizable landmarks, and yet, the wolf seemed to move with purpose, as if it knew the way. The golden eyes glanced back at him now and then, checking if he was still following. Ethan clutched his jacket tighter, his breath growing more labored in the cold. His flashlight flickered for a moment, and panic surged in his chest. If the battery died, he would be plunged into absolute darkness. Suddenly, the wolf stopped. Its ears perked, nose lifting slightly into the air as if catching a scent. Then, Ethan heard it too. Footsteps, crunching against the frozen earth. His pulse spiked. Was someone out here? Another hiker? A rescuer? Or something else? Ethan instinctively crouched behind a fallen tree, peering into the darkness. The wolf, however, stood its ground, watching intently. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure emerged through the trees, a man, his form barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the clouds. Ethan's heart pounded as he took in the stranger's appearance. He wore a thick coat, a hood pulled low over his face, and a rifle slung over his back. A hunter. But there was something off about him. The way he moved, slow and deliberate, scanning the trees as if looking for something, or someone. Ethan stayed frozen, unsure of what to do. The wolf remained still as well, watching the man with piercing intensity. Then, just as the man turned slightly, a glint of metal shone under the faint light, a knife strapped to his belt, its edge worn but sharp. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. This wasn't just any hunter. This man was dangerous. The wolf let out a low, warning growl, barely audible, but enough to send a wave of dread through Ethan. What had he just walked into? Ethan held his breath, barely daring to move. The hunter's boots crunched against the icy ground as he stepped closer, scanning the woods with a keen, predatory gaze. The rifle remained strapped to his back, but his hand hovered dangerously close to the knife at his hip. The wolf stayed unervingly still, watching the man with an intensity Ethan had never seen in an animal before. It was almost as if the wolf knew him. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the hunter turned and moved away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Ethan let out a shaky breath, relief flooding him, until he realized the wolf had begun to move again, following in the same direction the hunter had gone. "What are you doing?" Ethan whispered, glancing nervously after the figure. But the wolf only flicked an ear in response and kept walking. Ethan hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to go the other way. But if the wolf had led him this far, could it really be leading him into danger now? Swallowing his fear, Ethan followed. The night air grew colder as they moved deeper into the trees. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the faint crunch of the hunter's footsteps was still audible somewhere ahead. They were tracking him, Ethan realized with a jolt. Minutes passed, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then, suddenly, the hunter's footsteps stopped. Ethan and the wolf froze. A moment later, a sharp snap echoed through the trees, like a twig breaking under pressure. Then another. And another. Someone else was out here. Ethan barely had time to process the thought before a rustling movement erupted ahead. The hunter let out a sharp curse, and suddenly, the forest was alive with sound, shouting, footsteps, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. The wolf let out a low, urgent growl, then turned to Ethan and nudged his leg roughly. A silent command. "Run." Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted, the wolf at his side as the sounds of the unseen struggle behind them faded into the darkness. Ethan's legs burned as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped at his face, the cold air searing his lungs. The wolf ran beside him, its movements fluid and effortless, leading him deeper into the woods. Behind them, the sounds of the struggle grew fainter, but Ethan knew they weren't safe yet. Whoever those men were, they had weapons, and they wouldn't just let him disappear into the forest. The wolf suddenly veered left, and Ethan followed without hesitation. They stumbled into a rocky clearing, where the trees thinned just enough for the moonlight to illuminate a narrow ravine up ahead. Ethan skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. Where are we going?" he panted, but the wolf only turned to him with those golden eyes, as if urging him forward. Then, from the distance, an unmistakable sound cut through the night. A gunshot. Ethan flinched, his heart leaping into his throat. They had to keep moving. And trust the wolf to lead the way. Ethan's breath burned in his lungs as he sprinted after the wolf, his legs heavy with exhaustion. The gunshot still echoed in his ears, sending icy fear through his veins. Had the hunter seen them? Were they being pursued? The wolf led him down a steep incline, weaving between towering pines with effortless grace. Ethan struggled to keep up, slipping on loose rocks and damp leaves. His heart pounded, his mind racing with questions. Why was this animal helping him? How did it know where to go? A low growl from the wolf made Ethan stop in his tracks. The animal stood frozen ahead, ears perked, its golden eyes scanning the darkness. Something was nearby. Ethan held his breath, listening. The silence was thick, the kind that made his skin prickle. Then, there it was. The faint crunch of footsteps moving cautiously through the undergrowth. The hunter. Panic surged through him. He couldn't outrun a bullet. If the man had seen them, they were trapped. The wolf suddenly darted forward, disappearing behind a thick cluster of rocks. Ethan hesitated for only a second before following. He rounded the stones and nearly stumbled over his own feet. There, hidden beneath a thicket of tangled roots and fallen branches, was a narrow, dark passage leading downward into the earth. A cave. The wolf turned to him and let out a soft whine before stepping inside. Ethan swallowed hard. Every rational part of him screamed don't go in, but at this moment, the wolf was his only chance at survival. Gritting his teeth, he crouched low and followed it inside. The passage was narrow at first, forcing him to shuffle forward with his shoulders brushing against the cold, damp walls. The air smelled of earth and moss, thick and stale. His flashlight flickered as he moved, casting eerie shadows along the rough stone. Behind him, the world outside remained eerily silent. Had the hunter given up? Or was he just waiting? The tunnel gradually widened, opening into a larger cavern. Ethan's boots scraped against stone as he stepped inside, his breath echoing in the hollow space. His flashlight swept across the walls, stalactites hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, and a shallow underground stream trickled along the far side. The wolf stood near the center of the cavern, watching him expectantly. Ethan exhaled, letting the tension ease just slightly. They had found a hiding place. At least for now. But then he noticed something strange. Carved into the stone walls were symbols, faint, weathered, but unmistakably deliberate. Shapes resembling wolves, humans, and intricate patterns Ethan couldn't decipher. He stepped closer, running his fingers over the ancient markings. "What is this place?" he whispered. The wolf didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Ethan felt it in his bones. This place was old, sacred. And somehow, he was meant to find it. Before he could think further, a sound echoed from the tunnel entrance. Footsteps. The hunter had found them. The wolf's ears flattened, and a deep growl rumbled in its throat. Ethan clenched his fists, heart hammering. There was no way out, except forward. And so, with the wolf leading the way once more, he stepped deeper into the unknown. Ethan pressed his back against the cavern wall, his breath shallow as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnel. The wolf stood beside him, its golden eyes locked on the entrance, ears twitching at every sound. The hunter was here. Ethan's fingers tightened around a loose rock on the cave floor. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon he had. His pulse pounded in his ears as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until a shadow flickered at the tunnel's edge. Then, silence. The hunter had stopped. Ethan held his breath, his muscles coiled, waiting. The wolf remained completely still, watching, waiting, listening. A long moment passed, the silence stretching unbearably. Then, a faint shuffle, retreating footsteps. The hunter was leaving. Ethan dared to exhale, his legs nearly giving out from relief. He leaned his head back against the damp stone, closing his eyes for just a second. Why had the hunter left? Had he assumed they'd gone deeper? Or, had something scared him off? The wolf nudged Ethan's leg, pulling him back to reality. It turned, padding further into the cave, disappearing into the darkness. Ethan hesitated. Do I follow? He glanced back at the tunnel entrance. The hunter was still out there. If he left now, he'd be walking right into danger. But if he stayed... Gritting his teeth, he switched on his flashlight and hurried after the wolf. The cavern narrowed again, forcing Ethan to crouch as he followed the winding path. The air grew colder, the scent of damp earth filling his nose. The wolf moved confidently, as if it had traveled this path 100 times before. Then, the tunnel widened into another chamber. And this one made Ethan stop in his tracks. The walls were covered in carvings, thousands of them. Wolves, hunters, swirling symbols Ethan didn't recognize. The images told a story, an ancient tale etched into the rock by hands long forgotten. Ethan stepped closer, tracing his fingers over a central image, a large wolf standing beside a human figure. It was different from the others, more detailed, as if it was the heart of the story. His flashlight flickered again, casting strange shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, it almost looked like the carvings were moving, wolves running, hunters chasing, an eternal cycle frozen in time. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The wolf sat beside him, watching him closely. As if waiting. As if it knew something Ethan didn't. And then, in the eerie silence of the cavern, a realization settled over him. This place wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a message. A warning. But for whom? And why did he feel like he was part of it? Ethan ran his fingers along the ancient carvings, tracing the outline of the large wolf beside the human figure. His heart pounded with a strange sense of familiarity, like he had seen this before. But where? The wolf beside him let out a low huff, its golden eyes locked on Ethan. There was something knowing in its gaze, something almost expectant. This place, Ethan whispered, glancing around the chamber. It means something, doesn't it? The wolf didn't move, but Ethan could feel its presence, steady and unwavering. It knew. Ethan turned back to the carvings, studying them more closely. The images weren't just decorative, they told a story. The first carvings showed a pack of wolves, strong and free, running through the wild. Then came the hunters, spears raised, eyes filled with greed. The next few images were violent, wolves being captured, some slain, others caged. Ethan swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. But then, something changed. A new figure appeared among the hunters, a man, standing between them and the wolves. Protecting them. Ethan's breath caught. The figure wasn't like the others. His posture was different, almost defiant. And beside him, the large wolf stood tall, no longer a hunted creature, but an ally. A cold shiver ran through Ethan as realization clicked into place. His grandfather. He had heard the stories when he was younger, told in hushed voices by his father. His grandfather had once been a ranger, patrolling these very mountains. But there was one story that had always stood out, one that his father had always brushed off as a myth. His grandfather had saved a wolf pack from poachers. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Could it be? Before he could dwell on it further, a deep growl rumbled through the cave. Ethan spun, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The wolf had risen to its feet, ears pinned back, its golden eyes sharp and alert. Something was coming. Ethan held his breath, straining to listen. Faint footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them. Slow. Careful. Deliberate. The hunter hadn't given up after all. Ethan's stomach knotted. There was nowhere to run, no way to escape without being seen. The wolf moved beside him, pressing against his leg. And then, as if sensing Ethan's fear, it did something unexpected. It howled. The sound was haunting, deep, and powerful. It echoed off the cave walls, stretching far beyond the chamber. Then, silence. Ethan barely had time to process what had happened before another sound filled the cavern. More howls. Dozens of them. Coming from the darkness beyond. The hunter wasn't just walking into a cave. He was walking into a den. The haunting chorus of howls sent a chill through Ethan's spine. They echoed off the stone walls, growing louder, closer, until he could feel the presence of something watching. The hunter froze at the entrance of the cavern, his silhouette framed in dim light. He wasn't alone anymore. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he turned, scanning the shadows. Then, he saw them, pairs of glowing eyes blinking to life in the darkness. Dozens of them. Low to the ground, moving silently. The pack had arrived. The hunter took a slow step back, his fingers twitching toward his rifle. But before he could reach for it, the golden-eyed wolf at Ethan's side let out a deep, guttural snarl. It stepped forward, its hackles raised, teeth bared. A warning. The other wolves began to emerge from the shadows. Large, powerful, and silent as ghosts. Their eyes locked onto the intruder, their bodies tense with anticipation. The hunter hesitated. He knew. One wrong move, and he wouldn't stand a chance. Ethan's heart pounded as the tension thickened. The hunter wasn't just any lost traveler, he was after something. And if he was desperate enough to chase Ethan into an active wolf den, then whatever he was after, it wasn't just survival. The hunter's breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling as he assessed his situation. The rifle remained strapped to his back, but Ethan knew it wouldn't matter. If he so much as reached for it. The golden-eyed wolf lunged. It was a blur of motion, teeth flashing, a snarl ripping through the cavern like thunder. The hunter stumbled back, barely avoiding the attack. His boot caught on a loose rock, and he crashed to the ground. Silence. Then, he scrambled to his feet and ran. His retreating footsteps echoed through the tunnels, fading into the distance. The wolves didn't follow. They didn't need to. The pack had spoken. Ethan exhaled shakily, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The golden-eyed wolf stepped back to his side, its fierce expression softening. Ethan looked at it, realization dawning. It wasn't just a guide. It was a guardian. And it had been waiting for him. Ethan's legs felt weak as the tension slowly faded. The hunter was gone, but the echoes of what had just happened lingered in the air. He turned to the golden-eyed wolf, who stood watching him, its gaze filled with something deeper than mere animal instinct. It knew him. Ethan swallowed hard, his breath uneven. Why are you helping me?" he murmured. He knew he wouldn't get an answer, but he had to ask. The wolf held his gaze for a long moment. Then, as if deciding something, it turned, walking toward the far side of the cavern. It paused, glancing back at Ethan. It wanted him to follow. Ethan hesitated only for a second before stepping forward. The wolf led him through a narrow passage deeper into the cave. The air grew warmer, the scent of damp stone and earth filling his senses. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the one before, but what lay inside made Ethan's heart stop. Against the far wall, illuminated by a single shaft of moonlight from an unseen crack above, lay a bundle of old, weathered belongings. A backpack. A canteen. A rusted hunting knife. And a leather-bound journal. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached for it. The leather was cracked with age, but the initials burned into the cover were still clear as day. J.C. His grandfather's initials. Ethan's breath hitched. His grandfather had been here. He flipped open the journal, the pages brittled beneath his fingertips. The handwriting was hurried, but readable. October 12th. The poachers are close. I can hear their dogs at night. The pack won't last much longer. I have to act. Ethan's chest tightened as he scanned the entries. The deeper he read, the more the truth became clear. His grandfather hadn't just stumbled upon the wolves. He had protected them. Risked his life for them. And the wolves had never forgotten. Ethan looked up from the journal, his heart pounding. The golden-eyed wolf sat watching him, waiting. This wasn't just any wolf. It was a descendant of the very pack his grandfather had saved. And now, after all these years, it had returned the favor. Ethan sat on the cold stone floor, the journal resting in his lap, his mind racing. His grandfather had been here. Not just passing through, he had lived this, fought for this, and left behind a story that no one else knew. The golden-eyed wolf watched him closely, its presence grounding him. It had been leading him here all along, not just to safety, but to the truth. Ethan turned the pages carefully, scanning the faded ink. His grandfather's words painted a vivid picture of the past. I found the den today. The pups are weak, their mother injured. If I leave them now, they won't make it. Ethan swallowed hard. The poachers are setting traps all around the northern ridge. They know the pack is close. I destroyed 2 traps today, but it won't be enough. I have to keep moving. His fingers tightened around the worn edges of the journal. His grandfather hadn't just saved a few wolves, he had saved an entire bloodline. And now, generations later, one of them had found Ethan. The realization sent a shiver through him. Was it just instinct? Some unspoken understanding between man and beast? Or was there something deeper, something ancient that bound them together? Ethan looked at the golden-eyed wolf, his pulse steadying. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about belonging. Suddenly, the wolf's ears flicked, its head snapping toward the cave entrance. A low, warning growl rumbled in its throat. Ethan tensed. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Not hurried like before, not the frantic steps of a man running for his life. These were slower. More measured. The hunter was coming back. Ethan's breath hitched. The wolves had chased him away once, but this time, something felt different. More dangerous. The golden-eyed wolf rose, muscles coiled like a spring, eyes burning with a silent command. This wasn't over. And Ethan had a choice to make. Would he run? Or would he finally step into the role his grandfather had once taken, protector of the pack? The air inside the cave felt heavier, thick with tension as the slow, deliberate footsteps grew closer. Ethan's heart pounded. He could still hear the distant echoes of the wolves' warning howls from deeper within the mountains, but they weren't enough to keep the hunter away. He wasn't running this time. The golden-eyed wolf stood at his side, its fur bristling, muscles tense, waiting for Ethan's next move. Ethan clenched his fists. He had spent his whole life thinking of his grandfather as just an ordinary man, a good man, yes, but nothing more. Now, sitting in the very place his grandfather had once stood, knowing the sacrifices he had made, Ethan finally understood. This wasn't just about the wolves. This was about justice. A shadow appeared at the cave entrance. The hunter stepped inside, rifle slung over his shoulder, his movements cautious. His dark eyes scanned the cavern, landing on Ethan. You should have stayed lost, kid. Ethan swallowed, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Who are you? The hunter chuckled, his voice low and cold. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Ethan's fingers tightened around his grandfather's journal. Try me. The hunter smirked, stepping forward. You ever wonder why your grandfather disappeared so suddenly? Why no one ever really knew what happened to him? Ethan stiffened. He went missing in the mountains. That's what they wanted you to think. The hunter's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. But the truth? He made enemies. Enemies who never forgot. Ethan's blood ran cold. The poachers. This wasn't just some random hunter. This was personal. The golden-eyed wolf let out a low, warning growl, stepping between Ethan and the man. The other wolves shifted in the shadows, watching, waiting. The hunter glanced at them, unfazed. Your granddaddy got in the way of people who make a living off these creatures. His tone was almost casual. And now, you're doing the same. Ethan gritted his teeth. You're still hunting them. The hunter tilted his head. I finish what was started. A sickening realization settled in Ethan's stomach. This man wasn't just another predator in the woods, he was part of the same group his grandfather had fought against all those years ago. And now, history was repeating itself. Ethan could feel the weight of his grandfather's legacy pressing down on him. He wasn't just here by accident. He was meant to find this place. Meant to stand here. Meant to protect the pack. The golden-eyed wolf took another step forward, its growl deepening. The hunter's hand inched toward his rifle. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. This was it. The moment where everything would change. Would he fight? Or would he fall, just like his grandfather once had? Ethan's breath came in shallow bursts, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The golden-eyed wolf stood rigid beside him, hackles raised, its warning growl vibrating through the cave. The hunter's fingers twitched near the strap of his rifle. He hadn't drawn it yet, but Ethan knew he was waiting, calculating. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken threats. Ethan tightened his grip on his grandfather's journal. "You don't have to do this." His voice was steady, but inside, fear twisted like a vice. The hunter's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, but I do." Without warning, he moved, his hand flashing toward the rifle's strap. The golden-eyed wolf lunged. A snarl ripped through the air as the wolf struck, knocking the hunter off balance before he could fully raise the gun. The two tumbled to the ground in a blur of fur and flailing limbs. Ethan didn't think, he acted. He grabbed a nearby rock, heart pounding, and swung it toward the rifle, knocking it out of the hunter's grip. The weapon skidded across the cave floor, disappearing into the darkness. The hunter cursed, shoving the wolf off him, but before he could reach for his belt. Where a knife gleamed in the dim light, Ethan kicked out, knocking the weapon away. The wolf was on its feet again, circling the hunter, teeth bared. The man wiped his bloodied lip and exhaled sharply, sizing up Ethan with a look of both annoyance and something else, respect. "You've got fight in you, I'll give you that." He chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Your grandfather was the same way. Thought he could protect them forever." Ethan's fists clenched. "He did protect them. And so will I." The hunter rolled his shoulders, glancing between Ethan and the wolf. He seemed to consider his next move, whether to strike again or retreat. Then, to Ethan's surprise, the man smirked. "This ain't over, kid." With that, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the cave's entrance, his silhouette swallowed by the night. Ethan stood frozen, adrenaline still surging through his veins. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing. The golden-eyed wolf stepped beside him, nudging his leg. It was over. For now. But Ethan knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And he wasn't running anymore. He was ready to fight. For the wolves. For his grandfather's legacy. For something bigger than himself. The forest was eerily silent as Ethan stepped out of the cave, his pulse still racing from the confrontation. The golden-eyed wolf walked beside him, its head held high, ears twitching at every distant sound. The other wolves lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting. Ethan turned his gaze toward the tree lean, where the hunter had disappeared. The man had left, but he wasn't gone. Not really. The poachers would come back. They always did. Ethan exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air. He had a choice to make. He could turn back, hike his way down the mountain, pretend none of this had happened, or he could stay. He looked down at the journal in his hands. The worn leather cover, the pages filled with his grandfather's words, the proof that this fight had never ended, it had only been waiting for him. The golden-eyed wolf let out a low whine, nudging Ethan's hand as if sensing his hesitation. Ethan crouched, running his fingers through the wolf's thick fur. "I can't leave, can I?" His voice was barely a whisper. The wolf blinked slowly, as if it understood. Ethan straightened. His grandfather had fought for these wolves, protected them, given everything to ensure their survival. And now, Ethan would do the same. His fingers curled into fists. The poachers wouldn't win. Not this time. A distant howl rose in the night, and another answered. The wolves were calling to one another, preparing for what was to come. Ethan squared his shoulders. Let them come. He was ready. The night was restless. The wolves sensed it. Ethan sensed it. A storm was coming, not of wind and rain, but of blood and battle. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath steady, his heart hammering in his chest. The golden-eyed wolf stood beside him, ears perked, gaze fixed on the distant shadows beyond the trees. They were out there. Waiting. Watching. Ethan's grip tightened around the wooden handle of an old hunting knife he had found in the cave, a relic of his grandfather's past. He had never used a weapon like this before, but tonight, he would if he had to. A low growl rumbled through the wolves gathered behind him. More than a dozen had come, silent, powerful, ready. Then, a sound. A twig snapped in the darkness. Ethan's breath hitched. The golden-eyed wolf tensed. And then, gunfire. The first shot cracked through the night, echoing off the cliffs. The wolves scattered into the trees, moving like ghosts in the darkness. Ethan ducked behind a fallen log as another shot rang out, splintering the bark beside him. The poachers were here. And they weren't hunting animals anymore. Ethan clenched his jaw. No. Not this time. With the golden-eyed wolf at his side, he moved through the shadows, weaving between the trees, keeping low. The wolves weren't running, they were hunting. A cry of pain split the air, a poacher had been taken down. Snarls and shouts mixed together in a chaotic symphony of survival. Ethan saw movement ahead, one of the hunters, rifle raised, scanning the darkness. This was his moment. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan lunged forward, slamming the hunter's weapon aside before he could fire. The man stumbled, cursing, swinging wildly, but Ethan was faster. He shoved him back, knocking him into the underbrush. More gunfire. More movement. The poachers were outnumbered, outmatched. And then, silence. Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps as he turned, searching. The wolves had vanished into the night, their work done. The poachers were gone. Defeated. The golden-eyed wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Ethan with an expression he almost swore was approval. He had done it. They had done it. And as the first hints of dawn crept over the mountains, Ethan knew one thing for certain, his grandfather's fight was finally over. But his own? It was just beginning. The first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of gold and crimson. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Ethan stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly before him. It was over. The poachers had been driven away. The wolves had reclaimed their home. And Ethan. He had changed. The golden-eyed wolf sat beside him, silent and watchful. Its fur was matted with dirt, its muscles still tense from the night's battle. But there was something else in its eyes now, something deeper. Gratitude. Ethan knelt beside the wolf, running his fingers gently through its thick fur. "You saved me," he whispered. "All of you did." The wolf blinked, its gaze never leaving him. For the first time, Ethan truly understood. This wasn't just about survival. It never had been. It was about trust. A bond formed long before he was ever born. A debt repaid, not with words, but with action. His grandfather had once saved these wolves. And now, they had saved him. Ethan exhaled, glancing down at the worn leather journal still clutched in his hand. His grandfather's words, his legacy, his fight, Ethan would carry it forward. A distant howl echoed through the valley, followed by another. The wolves were calling. Ethan smiled. This was where he belonged. As he rose to his feet, the golden-eyed wolf turned, stepping forward into the forest. Then, it paused, glancing back at Ethan once more. An invitation. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. And then, with steady steps, he followed the wolf into the wild. Where he was meant to be.